Welcome to today's conversation on the reasons and implications of Prime Minister Carney's trade strategy. We're extremely pleased to be joined today by Eric Miller, President of Rideau Potomac Strategy Group and a member of the Canadian Council for the Americas Board of Directors. Solange Márquez, Professor at the University of Toronto and UNAM University Law School, and a future CCA Fellow. And Ben Gedan, Senior Fellow and Director of the Latin America Program at the Stimson Center, as well as Ken Frankel, President of the Canadian Council for the Americas, who will be joining me as co-moderator for today's conversation. Thank you all so very much for being here today, and a special thank you to the Stimson Center's Latin America Program for its partnership on this event. So while this conversation is really focused on the trade war currently taking place, I'll just start off by saying that all of it has taken place within a difficult political relationship in which the trade pressure has been intertwined with repeated comments from President Trump questioning Canada's sovereignty and its economic relationship with the US. Those comments aren't separate from the trade dispute, and they've really shaped the political context in which the negotiations are taking place, and have become a significant part of how Canada understands and responds to the current moment. So with that quick synopsis, I'm just going to please invite Eric to join us to kick us off and really bring us to what happened last week, because I think that's where we want to start things off. And Eric, if we could start with you, if you could walk us through what actually happened last week, and particularly, the late days leading up to Carney retreating and pulling back our negotiators, and why did he do that, and why the call he made on Friday evening?
Yes, thank you, Marta. Happy to do so. So to understand what happened last week, I'll say a little bit about what came before. You've had this challenging trade relationship between Canada and the United States for some time. But the Trump administration has marked a new chapter. When you saw the return of President Trump to the White House, almost immediately as president-elect, he announced that he would put 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico over the issue of fentanyl. Canada accounts for 0.5% on average of fentanyl that comes into the U.S., but it was declared an emergency because that gave President Trump the authority under the International Economic Emergency Powers Act of 1977. Ultimately, that was struck down about a year later by the Supreme Court. But you've had this desire of President Trump to remake the terms of trade internationally. And we saw many countries come to the table and make deals with the United States that were quite one-sided. Japan and Europe, for example, agreed to deals where you would have 15% tariffs for their goods going into the U.S. and nothing for U.S. goods going to their countries. Canada took a very different strategy. Partly that was driven by the fact that goods from March of 2025 that qualified under the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement, as they call it in Canada, or USMCA, as it's also commonly known, that they got duty-free treatment into the United States. There were many special categories, from steel and aluminum to lumber to automotive, where you had separate tariffs that went on top of that. In mid-July, the Trump administration, after having not really had deep conversations with Canada for 9 months or so, announced that it was putting 50% tariffs on roughly 5% of Canada's exports to the US. And this set off a mad process that led to the discussions, which ultimately broke down. Canada went into these negotiations with a number of objectives. The first objective was to avoid the tariffs, which were originally due to come into effect on August 19th, and then were extended for 3 days. It sought to get relief on some of the Section 232 tariffs, these special tariffs, which had driven, for example, the value of or the tariff on softwood lumber to 45% on average across the country, and high levels in other jurisdictions. And it also wanted some clarity about what the negotiating pathway would look like for the future renegotiation of the trilateral USMCA, Canada, US, Mexico agreement. And there had been, of course, U.S. conversations with Mexico. Solange will go into detail about how Mexico has seen that, but there were 3 rounds of U.S. negotiation with Mexico. These negotiations with Canada really covered many issues. They covered automotive, steel and aluminum, lumber, alcoholic beverages. But as things went down the stretch, there were demands that the United States made around not mandating U.S. streamers to prioritize, say, French language content in the province of Quebec, something that, say, Netflix is required to do in Europe. They didn't want to do that in North America. You also had demands that Canada mirror U.S. trade action. So if the U.S. were to put a tariff on an import from Colombia, for example, that Canada would be required to essentially mirror that tariff. Canadians saw this as a grave violation of their sovereignty, coupled with the fact that the tariff reductions on steel, aluminum, and other things were not deemed as sufficient, coupled with the fact that there were different demands coming from different parts of the U.S. negotiating team. Differences between Commerce and USTR seem to have come into it. But all of that led Mark Carney at 1:45 on the deadline before the tariffs to call the negotiators home. He was widely hailed in the media, by the premiers, by others in the country as having made the right decision, stood up for Canada. He announced that there would be dollar for dollar tariffs on the U.S. that would come into effect on September 8th. The specific list of tariff items has been released today on the day of recording, and so is certainly available on the Global Affairs website. President Trump has also announced that there would be a new 50% tariff on vehicles and on parts that come from Canada. And so we are in the ratchet cycle at present, and the trade relations have really broken down. But it's important to stress that Mark Carney, in walking away from the U.S. and not accepting the deal, has done something that nobody else did. Canada, along with China, were the only 2 countries to put counter tariffs on the U.S. Mark Carney's also the only Western leader who has stood up and rejected the demands from the Trump administration, which means this is a very interesting test case about how middle powers, as it were, will deal with the Trump administration going forward. So I'll leave it there.
Eric, what's happened though? You want to talk a little bit about what's happened over the last 24 hours?
Sure. So over the last 24 hours, the main developments have been that Prime Minister Carney has essentially said that Canada will only return to the negotiating table if the U.S., quote, changes its attitude. We've seen President Trump come out very strongly against Canada's position, threatening new tariffs, even threatening to rename the Great Lake, which is known as Lake Ontario, to Lake America. So not unlike the Gulf of Mexico renaming in 2025. And we've also seen major exchanges of words between the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, and the President of the United States. And so the kind of message discipline which Canada enforced on itself for a year and a half really broke down. Now Canada is trying to get that back into a message of being constructive. But there has been an enormous upwelling of emotion on both sides. Vice President Vance said that in Maine, said that Canada and China were the 2 worst countries, and that Canada had lots of transshipped Chinese goods going through it, which there is no evidence for. So both sides are in a position of frustration and indeed in some quarters of rage. But the key development is that President Trump announced the 50% tariffs on automobiles and parts effective on January 1st. And Prime Minister Carney made good on his statements about dollar-for-dollar tariffs and released the list today. Those tariffs go into effect on September 8th.
Thanks, Eric. Just Eric, staying with you for one bit more. You want to talk a little bit about the strategy of the tariffs that Mark Carney has imposed today?
Yes. So when you're developing lists of tariffs in trade disputes, you want to go after things that minimize the pain on domestic producers and consumers and maximize the pain on the other side. And so you've seen a wide array of items on the US list. The Canadian list really does two things. One, it partially mirrors the US list. It includes things such as aluminum and lots of lumber products, which were heavily prevalent on the US list. And also it includes some measures that are presumably targeted at either sensitive political races or at states that tend to lean toward President Trump's Republican Party. And in some of these cases, for example, the case of lobsters, a lot of the lobsters that get harvested in Maine get processed in Canada and sent back. And similarly, during the harvest season in Canada, a certain quantity get processed in the United States and sent back. And so these relationships of co-production are being put in jeopardy, but there is a major Senate race in Maine. Vice President Vance was just campaigning in Maine yesterday and talking about Canada. So this is the response. And you see other states from Kentucky to Tennessee to Michigan to Wisconsin that clearly have companies that will be affected by this. And so the idea is to maximize the pain on the US side so that the businesses who are losing out will call the White House and encourage them to come back to the bargaining table.
Thanks so much, Eric. And I think we're going to open it up to see how our other trade partner in the North America trade dynamic is seeing this, and how Mexico is reading Washington's treatment of Canada, and what, if anything, is it changing how Mexico approaches its own position within the North America trade relationship. Solange, if I can have you commenting on that, thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. It is interesting, and in Mexico, from the side, the official position is an optimistic view. Mexico is very confident on the strategy they have been following on the last months. They have had, different to Canada, they have had 3 rounds of negotiation. Eric mentioned that before. So they are going to the 4th round on September in Washington. So for Mexico, it has been a different path than with Canada. So by now, what we see in Mexican position is that they feel very confident. They feel this as a completely separated thing than what is happening in the negotiation table with Mexico and the US. On the other side, it is interesting to understand that from the side of the businesses and the analysts, it is not that easy, because the thing is that the strategy from Mexico has been completely different to the one in Canada. Mexico has been appeasing to Washington. Mexico has been doing a lot of concessions in different things that are separated to trade. Just to mention something, in migration issues and security issues. And I have to say also, as Eric was mentioning, one of the issues that created what is happening with Canada now, it was that the sovereignty issues and the interest of Washington on pushing Mexico and Canada at the same level on mirroring the tariffs the US has been imposing in other countries. So in the case of Canada, it is clear what we see. Canadian government has said no to that. But in the case of Mexico has been different. Mexico has been saying yes, it has been taking measures on imposing tariffs, for example, with China or India. So Mexico has been working with the United States in some things that they believe, the Mexican government believe, that will make them easy to accomplish, to have a deal. So that's interesting to see, especially if we are thinking on a trilateral agreement. Because what we have been seeing in the last 18 months, it is more than bilateral agreements working on a frame of a trilateral agreement. And I think the problem with the two different strategies and what has happened with Canada now is that the approach of Canada and the approach of Mexico is going to create a bigger gap on this trilateral agreement. It might create more opportunities for Mexico to have an agreement with the United States, but completely separated, because I don't see the Mexican government trying to join forces with Canada now in issues that are a concern together. In the case of automotive sector or minerals, different sectors that they have interest together, but they are not going to work together now. They haven't been working together, but they have been having talks, and some parts of the private sector has been pushing for trying to create a common, a joint strategy. But I don't see that now, because Mexico will try to step aside of what is happening with Canada and what might happen with Mexico. They are going to be afraid of having the same things happening to Mexico in September.
I think that's a really good point that we want to go into what is potentially left of a tripartite agreement. But before we get to that, Ben, how is this reverberated in Washington in your view? Not just officially, but actually what people really think in the corridors when they're talking frankly with each other.
I mean, it's pretty stunning deterioration of a relationship that had long been taken for granted. There's long been this sense that the United States could project power globally because it took for granted the stability of its relationships with its neighbors. And it's not, coincidence that these neighbors are also the two biggest trading partners of the United States, that these borders, though there are, obviously challenges with organized crime and migration on the southwestern border, they are safe borders, right? They don't represent major risks to U.S. national security. And because of those good relationships, the United States has been able to dedicate itself both in diplomatic energy and in its investments of its military foreign assistance and other elements of national power to being involved in far-flung regions. And again, I mean, the speed and depth of this breakdown in U.S.-Canadian relations beyond the trade talks is really hard, I think, for many here to understand. And to understand what it means more broadly for a project of hemispheric integration. And we can talk about that in a bit, but we had also taken for granted that the direction of travel was greater integration, and that what had happened in North America would maybe ultimately be a model for the rest of the Western Hemisphere, and that, with fits and starts and with disagreements about the value of some trade agreements, that everyone basically thought it was in the U.S. economic and national security interests to have a well-integrated region. And now, if we can't manage relations with our two biggest trading partners and our neighbors, it's very hard to imagine a hemisphere with any kind of meaningful and durable coalition of countries in order to improve economic competitiveness in the United States and other markets, and in order to, again, have the United States with the comfort that it has a peaceful and friendly region, and so it can dedicate, again, attention and resources elsewhere. And so it really is a profound moment, Ken, and it goes well beyond the economic consequences.
But do you see, Eric described the states that are going to be hardest hit, very strategically targeted. At some point, if it's not going on to an extent already, do you see the Republicans going to their president and saying, this is enough is enough, I'm going to break with this and I'm going to come out, or I have to do something to completely break with this policy, or my political fortunes are down the drain?
Yeah, I think that's doubtful at this point. I think the president, although some of his candidates in recent primaries were not successful, is still seen as a kingmaker in the Republican Party, so much so that I doubt any Republican candidates or office holders would publicly break with him. But you're right. I think they'll be under increasing pressure to push back. I mean, there's a variety of policies from the Iran war to tariffs more broadly, even the immigration policy that have had negative economic consequences on a lot of so-called red states. And certainly, Canada has strategically imposed retaliatory tariffs in order to maximize and concentrate the damage in the states of politically vulnerable Republicans. So I think there will be plenty of internal disagreement and disapproval within Republican circles, but I very much doubt you'll see anyone publicly criticizing the president on these issues.
Eric, can I bring you back in here and also just to comment on a bit of what Ben just mentioned in terms of sort of, because I think there's also a consolidation and a Canadian perspective on what this is doing for Canada. Could you comment a little bit on that and how Canada is seeing it in relation to its relations with other countries and more globally?
Yeah, so Canada is, I think it's fair to say that this breakdown is likely to persist for some time. This is not like a classic trade impasse. This is Canada feeling that the administration asked for fundamental things that Canada was simply unprepared to give. And until those demands demonstrably change, then Canada and the US are likely to have this standoff. Canada's theory of action on how do you make this change is to essentially play on the fact that Canada is an exceptionally important export market for the United States. If you go to any Department of Commerce trade person who is counseling exporters, the commercial service always says, well, start with Canada, get your feet wet there. It's a good export market. And so there's a lot of companies that send 30% of their exports to Canada. There's a lot of companies that sell $300 million a year worth of product to the Canadian supermarkets. There's a lot of products that go on the store shelves of well-known retailers like Canadian Tire. And all of those products are going to find that they're being priced out because at the same time as US products are facing tariffs, Canada also is continuing to respect its relatively low most favored nation rates with other countries, and it's continuing to respect its free trade agreement. So producers in Mexico will still be able to export to Canada duty-free. But the US producers are going to find that they're increasingly suffering in the Canadian market. And so as this pain begins to accumulate and you start to see people who are active in the political process, who give money into the political process, who said, my market in Canada has collapsed. You saw, for example, massive amounts of U.S. wine that was not able to be sold in Canada, and they're pulling up vineyards in California. And so these trade disruptions are something that's very real. I think what Solange said is extremely important about the future of the trilateral agreement, and we'll need to dive deeply into that, because if there is an agreement with Mexico bilaterally, and if there is no obvious pathway to an agreement with Canada, does the USMCA agreement somehow get suspended altogether? Does it become simply a bilateral agreement? What does that do to supply chains? And so there is a real risk of a breakdown here. And for Canada, it's now in a situation where, it's kind of like Singapore in 1965, having broken with the Malaysian Federation. It is now having to figure out how to become better and faster and more relentless than all of its neighbors in order to build prosperity. But this is kind of that foundational moment potentially. And with no easy way back with trade with the US, that's going to affect many countries in the hemisphere and around the world.
Thanks, Eric. Solange, did you want to comment on that same point, but from a Mexican perspective in terms of sort of bringing up the trilateral agreement again and how Mexico's seeing itself in relation to other countries?
Yeah, what is interesting, considering also again the strategy that Mexico and Canada has been following on this thing. Canada has been trying to diversify the economy. We know that they have been pushing for new trade agreements with different countries. Mexico, on the other side, Mexico had a lot of trade agreements. Mexico had more than 50 trade agreements already signed. The thing is that Mexico is not using them. And it is interesting since everything on this started, that beside a lot of analysts and people advising the government to try to follow up a strategy similar to Canadian strategy to diversify the economy, Mexican government has been just ignoring them. They are not doing this. They are putting let me put it like that, all the eggs in just the United States basket. Because they are very confident on having a deal. Of course, it is understandable. The relationship with the United States is huge, and the economy depends a lot on that. And it is not easy to try to change supply chains, and it is something that will take many years. It is not something that will take months, especially in one of the key sectors for Mexican economy, which is the automobile sector. But however, it is not pursuing that. On that, it is interesting how the Mexican relationship, for example, as I said before, with China or India, it is changing considering the interest of Washington. So Mexican relationship with other countries is changing, is following the same paths, according not something that that the White House is demanding already. It is following the idea of the Mexican government that they have. Washington is going to ask. So Mexico is trying to do these changes beforehand, trying to appease, as I said before, appease Washington in order to keep things quiet and calm and continue with this negotiation. So something that the Mexican government internally has been selling as a patience strategy. It is not exactly just patience. It is much more like trying to keep Washington happy with what Mexico has been doing.
Solange, that's an interesting point. I actually want to come to Ben in a second, but I just want to follow up with you on that point, Solange. We've done events in the past where we addressed that belief amongst others, and you'll still see it in the press, that you don't see it so much anymore, but the extent is, gee, Canada should take a book out of take a page out of Claudia Sheinbaum's book, and because she's getting everything she wants from Mexico, from Washington not being attacked, and what our prior events showed, and I think what you said when you use the word appease, that's a fairly strong word. And so let me ask: are there any red lines that Mexico has in its dealings with the United States, other than some of the issues that have come up about landing U.S. troops in Mexico?
Yeah, and absolutely. I use appease. I know it's a strong word, but I think it is the best word that applies here. I have been following the media, especially in Canada, about Mexico and Mexican government. And I have said this in other places, as it is interesting for Mexicans how internationally people tend to see the Mexican government as with a good relation with the United States, just because. It is not just because. Donald Trump treats very well Claudia Sheinbaum, just because Mexico has been saying yes to most of the demands of the United States, starting with the migration issues, continuing with the criminal cartels and security issues. So Mexico has been putting and saying yes to many things, and there are a lot of examples. Maybe it's not the place to say that, but there are many things that Mexico has been doing besides the trade things. So they have been saying in other issues, trying to comply with what Washington is demanding. So when I see the Mexican government continuing in this relationship, and people saying Canada should follow the same path, I'm not quite sure. I don't have the answer on which strategy is going to be the best, because now we are seeing Canada out of the negotiation table, and Mexico is still there, but for how long? Something that it is interesting for Mexico in September is going to see that for now, Washington is not a reliable ally. As Mark Carney said, and what he was referring when he talk about signature with a pencil, it is because you can expect different tariffs in different moments, even though you have an agreement. We have an agreement now. We have the USMCA, and still we had tariffs. So the problem is, and I think we have analysts like to say that the USMCA has been in intense therapy for 18 months. But now I think it's the moment that we should apply this concept. Because the thing is that we are not negotiation, not Canada nor Mexico, we are not negotiation a free trade agreement. We are negotiation the reducing of tariffs on some strategic things like steel, like aluminum in auto parts, but we are negotiating tariffs, not free trade agreements. So the problem is that in the case, as I said, Mexico continue with the same strategy without Canada. It is going to have a bilateral agreement, but just with the frame of the USMCA.
Ben, you've done a lot of thoughtful writing about pointing out the dichotomy, or the maybe that's the nicest word of saying it, between a U.S. government that wants to wean, or at least wean Latin America off of Chinese engagement, or certainly, if not wean off, certainly lessen, and have them turn their attentions and affections back towards the United States, while at the same time hitting them all with tariffs, regardless of their loyalty. Now, the government, U.S. government, is now trying to gauge Latin America in the shield of the Americas and other security kinds of things. Does this breakdown in negotiations with Canada exacerbate the doubts that Latin Americans have even about signing up hook, line, and sinker with United States? Or it's just the same? They'll say something as official policy, but at the end of the day, still pursue their integration, as it were, or commerce with, and economic relations with China in the way that they had?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I really do think there's a paradox in U.S. policy under this so-called new Monroe Doctrine. You had the Trump administration comes into office. There was a Wall Street Journal op-ed by a Cuban-American Secretary of State who's a fluent Spanish speaker, calling for a golden age for the Americas, an America's first policy, and a national security white paper that declares the U.S. returning to preeminence in Latin America, and very clearly alluding in all of these cases to China, and finding a way back to excluding China from the region, at least as as a really influential new partner for countries in Latin America. And so much of US policy since then has moved in the other direction and has led Canadians to boo the US national anthem and to adopt this elbows up policy. In Mexico, Pew polling has found now that more Mexicans have faith in China over the United States, which was not the trend previously. And that wasn't because of increased admiration for China, but because of a huge decrease in confidence in US foreign policy. Again, those are the two US neighbors and its most important trading partners. But the Pew polling shows that this is true throughout Latin America, that the United States president is not only, rather unpopular at home, but unpopular throughout much of the Western Hemisphere. The question is whether anyone in the region is going to adopt the kind of aggressive posture we've now seen in Canada. And I think most likely is what you've just heard from Mexico, which is that it won't happen. It won't happen anytime soon. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And most of them, I think, are structural. You have a region with great dependence on the United States and great fears of U.S. retribution and coercive diplomacy. A region that saw the United States invade South America for the first time in January of this year to arrest and kidnap the president of Venezuela, to impose an oil embargo on Cuba that has caused 20-hour plus blackouts and severe humanitarian consequences, to threaten to attack Mexico and Colombia so regularly that it now doesn't even make headlines when the United States suggests it might commit acts of wars in those countries, to threaten to invade Panama and to recapture the Panama Canal. And so I do think you see Latin Americans in general, really because of fragmentation and fear, and in some cases, ideological connections with the Trump administration, unwilling or unable to stand up, even in, as the list of U.S. policies that are unfavorable to the region really extends. Right. I mean, I think we've talked about the tariffs, but there's also the mass deportation policy, including sending Latin Americans to Liberia. The implications in Central America of the loss of remittances from a remittances tax, but also from this mass deportation campaign, this militarization of security policy, environmental policies that are very unfavorable for the Caribbean with respect to climate change, sea level rise, the hurricanes. It's quite a long list. And really, Brazil is the only example we have seen of a country in the region kind of openly resisting the United States, investing openly in a de-risking strategy, trying to diversify its economic relationships. Why just Brazil? It's not just the ideological divisions. It's also that it has a very small reliance on the United States. It isn't like Mexico, which sends 80% of its exports to the U.S. market because it's big enough to sustain whatever punishment might come its way. And in fact, it succeeded. Right? Where you have the United States initially impose a 50% tariff on Brazil, trying to intervene in a judicial process, the prosecution of a former president who is convicted of coup plotting, and then only to have those tariffs withdrawn when Brazil showed zero interest in accommodating Washington. So I'll just say that, I think for now, the kinds of behaviors we see in nature, schooling and mobbing behaviors that small animals often adopt when threatened by a larger animal, we just have not seen them develop in the Americas, and it's not clear they will. I'll just end by saying that the only thing that could really make that happen is if the political calculations change, right? Trump has been very politically beneficial to several of his adversaries in the world, to the Prime Minister of Canada, to the President of Brazil, right? I mean, there are cases where Trump's interventions have been really favorable to the candidates that he opposes. If that becomes more common as the U.S. becomes less and less popular in Latin America, maybe the political incentives change. But for now, you have actually the trend moving in the other direction. Pro-Trump conservatives winning elections despite Trump's unpopularity and are very unlikely to take steps against the United States.
Thanks so much, Ben. Solange, did you want to comment on what Ben just mentioned in terms of the region and sort of how they're seeing that and the work, and then I'll go over to Eric after that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. And completely agree with what Ben said. And the thing is, with the rest of the countries of Latin America, the dependence on the it is only the decision on facing saying yes or no to the United States is dependent on their dependence on economical dependence. So in the case of Mexico, Mexican government doesn't have another option. If I can say it has an option to try to diversify for the future, for the long term, But the thing is that right now, Mexico cannot perceive their future without an agreement. And the thing is, in the case of the rest of the countries in Latin America, the economies are so small in many cases that no counting with the United States as an ally, as a partner, is not an option.
Thanks so much, Solange. Eric, if I can bring you back into this and sort of reframing this within the context of the trade war with Canada and the US and what's happening there right now, and what that can look like in terms of Canada's relations through the region. Ben just highlighted several countries across the region. And so if you could bring that into context for us a bit in terms of Canada and its positionality there.
Yeah, so one of the interesting consequences of the breakdown is that the work of the Canadian Council for the Americas, Latin America more broadly, becomes much, much more important, because the imperative of Canada finding new markets and really growing is much more immediate than it perhaps was before the breakdown in trade talks. So Canada is going through this process of reimagining and remaking its trade relations, which will include in Latin America, where it has the most trade agreements of any part of the world. And those agreements are not, by and large, being used anywhere close the potential that is out there. But if it looked, for example, at exporting LNG to Chile, there's a real opportunity there for Canada to displace U.S. natural gas exports, which come from the Gulf Coast and have to go through the Panama Canal and all the rest of it. But Canada could sell off the West Coast and down into the region. One thing, though, that when you think about what's different in this case, one of the things that has informed a lot of the breakdown of the Canada-U.S. relationship that has not been prevalent in the U.S.-Mexico relationship are the consistent statements by President Trump of a desire to annex Canada. There have been repeated statements. I'm sure there are dozens of references by now about Canada becoming the 51st state, about the Canadian Prime Minister being called governor. And indeed, when the trade talks broke down, President Trump's tweet on Saturday was, Canada wants the benefits of being a state without being one, and implying that it should actually be a state after all. And so when you look at these core concerns about sovereignty, it means that decisions about, do you mirror U.S. tariffs? Do you agree that U.S. streamers don't have to prioritize local content? That you are essentially signing the death warrant for your automotive industry because the tariffs are too high and you can net out the U.S. content in your tariff calculations but not your Canadian content. All of that gets seen through the lens of an existential threat. It helped to make Mark Carney Prime Minister. It has driven a lot of the public anger in Canada and explains why people are so enraged about what the Trump administration has done. It has defined a lot of personal decisions, where by some calculations, in the first year of President Trump's time in office, Canadian tourist spending in the U.S. was down $3.3 billion, which is not nothing. And so, there's a level of anxiety within the Canadian context, which doesn't exist in a more immediate way in Latin America. I mean, you've had in Brazil the threats on Jair Bolsonaro's case. You've had threats to intervene in Colombia and Mexico. But presumably somebody in Mexico sat somebody in the U.S. down and explained that the one sure path to blow up the relationship with Mexico is for the U.S. to intervene militarily. And might they start by reading the history of 1835 And this is a great differentiator, but still, having taken this position, Mark Carney is now the test case for how does the relationship with the U.S. look when someone pushes back on U.S. demands, and we don't know what that looks like. And unfortunately, there's no easy pathway back to something like a good, constructive relationship between Canada and the U.S., and real uncertainty about the future of the USMCA agreement. And so that will have a direct impact on Mexico, on trilateral supply chains, but it will also be an example to the world. Because just to finish on this point, I did a study recently where I looked at who was the largest supplier of goods to every country in the world, and whether it was China, Europe, or the US. Only in North America did the US have a major region where it was the largest supplier of goods. Even by 2000, the US was not the largest supplier in Mercosur. The European Union was. Now it's China. And so the US position in Latin America has been eroding for some time. But to see a breakdown in North America is something that is not only profound in terms of the bilateral relationship, but in terms of the US export position relative to major competitors globally. It is something that could end up being disastrous and could cause even North America to pass into the column of other jurisdictions.
Eric, I want to, Solange, do you have any comment on what Eric just said? He brought Mexico into that comment.
Yeah, very, very, very quickly. And the case of the Mexican government, I think it is a matter of time. It is a matter of time in the case of what might happen with the negotiation and what they can expect. Something that it is interesting here when it is mentioned and that you asked before, it is the red lines. Because Mexico has been working with the United States. They had been attacked. They verbally and in the narrative. The Mexican government has been trying to concede in many things. And in the case of the red lines and the sovereignty narrative, I think it's very interesting to see how Canada has been using the sovereignty narrative and Mexico has been using the sovereignty narrative in a different way. In the case of Canada, what I see is Canadians support Mark Carney when he stands up against impositions, what they see as impositions from the United States. In the case of Mexico, the sovereignty is seen or it is used as a tool for the Mexican government, but not to stand up, just to keep a narrative against those red lines that the Mexican government doesn't want to concede to the U.S. What are those red lines? Specifically, not in trade matters. I see those red lines more in security issues. As you said, something like boots on the ground in Mexico is a red line, but also what is happening now with the investigations against some public servants in Mexico, like governors or senators, or these kind of things is what Mexican government is seeing as red lines. So how they have been facing this, besides standing up, I see a strategy of conceding in other things, like the Mexican security minister has been participating with the DEA. He has been working very closely with them in order to secure some capos from the narco in Mexico, working on different issues inside Mexico. So they are working and cooperating much more than what we saw during the previous president, López Obrador. So what I see is those red lines, but in a different approach with the Mexico using the sovereignty narrative.
Thanks, Solange. We're getting short on time. I want to ask what happens from here. It seems, Eric, it's the case. Then Canada's announcement of what the tariffs are going to be, they don't go into effect immediately. It's September 8th. So is that part of a strategy by Mark Carney saying, basically, look, we've been waiting for you, and you to have conversations with us. We've been waiting, and then when the U.S. decides it's ready to have those conversations, basically, it will grant those conversations to Canada. To a certain degree now, by suspending it to September 8th, is Mark Carney saying, okay, we took your best shot, and now we're going to set a deadline. Now it's September 8th, and I'm giving you some time to see what you want to do about that. What's the strategy there, do you think?
So one of the things that Mark Carney has been very careful with is to not act impulsively. And so there is, he is the very opposite of someone who would get on social media and put out strong statements about some issue or another. He's very considered. And culturally, he is a central banker to the core. And central bankers are careful with their words, they're careful with their actions, and that's how he thinks about it. So the September 8th deadline is a way of signaling to the U.S., if you want to come back to the table, we're amenable to speaking with you. But he made clear at the announcement of the Coast Guard cutters yesterday in Lévis, Quebec, that the U.S. would have to come with a different set of positions before Canada would be willing to return to the table. But by offering this deadline of September 8th, he's giving every opportunity for that, without having a great deal of optimism, presumably, that the U.S. will take him up on this offer. And so tariffs are in effect on Canada. Canadian tariffs will go into effect on the U.S. Supply chains will begin to be compromised. You're looking at, on average, for many softwood lumber products, 95% tariffs. That means that the cost of building a home in the United States becomes extraordinarily more expensive because the U.S. only produces 70% of the softwood lumber that it consumes. And so it imports an awful lot from abroad, 85% of which comes from Canada. And so the sad thing is that in order to be able to get to a different place, there's going to have to be a lot of suffering, because there will have to be an agreement that, no, we're not going to talk about these fundamental things that would compromise Canadian sovereignty. And also Mark Carney, having seen the outpouring of support for taking a tough line on Trump, not only in Canada, but you've seen people in Europe, like I read the quote from a former president of Italy who said, this is a speech referring to his Saturday remarks that we need to hear in Europe. So having cast himself as the great resistor and moderator of action, it gets very tricky. And so what Mark Carney's looking for is for the U.S. view to change, for a narrow view for a narrower set of options to come into play, for the auto sector to begin to go to the White House and say, Canada exports a lot of its vehicles to the U.S., but Canada is also the largest export market for U.S.-made vehicles in the world. And, we begin to destroy supply chains. It means our export market there disappears, just like their export market here disappears. And, surprise, surprise, the supply chains don't match up. So what happens is, Canada is in a new period where it really has to, having been, as some would see it, cast out, it now has to find its way. And as it finds its way, which includes closer relationships in Latin America, a finishing of the Mercosur free trade agreement, among other things, the relationship with the U.S. becomes less completely central to everything. It always will be important. I mean, there are large parts of the United States energy system that would not function without Canadian oil. So, for example, all of the refineries in the Midwest are configured to take Canadian heavy oil, and that's not going to change. But as the share begins to go down, and some data I've seen shows that the U.S., having historically been 75% of Canada's exports, is now down to 2/3 of exports and falling. That is going to change over time, and with that, so come the changes in calculations about when the parties are willing to go back to the table.
Thanks, Eric. So, Ben, to the extent that you might characterize a coherent strategy in Washington on this, is the bet, might you surmise, that the pressure and the pain that Canada will suffer will force them to the table sooner than the potential collapse of the Republican Senate and House in November, or some other consequence?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, a couple different hypotheses. One is that the president is not sort of interested in the midterm elections, and that he has kind of other priorities and his legacy in mind, and so will not likely change his position, even if it creates unfavorable political conditions for his party in the midterm election. I think another hypothesis is that there's simply disbelief in Washington that de-risking is possible in relationships with this level of economic dependence. We've talked about it in the case of Mexico. Even if it's only 2/3 of Canada's exports go to the United States, that's quite significant. And even more broadly throughout Latin America, I think there is just a fundamental belief in Washington, in the Trump administration, that the United States has the wherewithal to dominate the region, and it can do so with a policy that leans heavily on sticks and has very few carrots to offer. And so far, frankly, the signals that it has received reinforce that notion, right? We've talked a few times now that Latin America more broadly, and until this confrontation, North America as well, has not really stood up to the United States, not in individual cases nor groups of countries. Now, I think behind the scenes, there's a lot of evidence that this is counterproductive. You've seen just this month alone, the president of Ecuador, the foreign minister of Chile, and the president of El Salvador's Congress all travel to China. Now, these are three countries governed by pro-Trump conservatives. You saw Mercosur, the two biggest South American economies, Argentina and Brazil, sign a trade agreement with the EU that had been negotiated for decades, but it was this desire to diversify relationships that led to that agreement. So I think there's a lot of evidence right now that the United States is overplaying its hand with real structural long-term consequences. But in the short term, I think the administration in Washington simply thinks that its neighbors will blink and that it will win each and every one of these confrontations.
Thank you, Ben. Solange, you're going to have the last word. There's a few questions I have for you, but maybe the best way is for you to comment on what you've heard and add anything else you want from a Mexican point of view. I would add that you did mention all of the trade agreements that Mexico has, yet a lot of them have been, might say, vastly underutilized, or potential commercial relations. So in the conversations that we have, for example, with the Mexican government about potential intra-regional trade with Brazil, for example, what is the potential there? And I know there's been some more activity at the sub-ministerial level, but there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of take-up, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe you can correct me, in Mexico on really seriously diversifying beyond and using beyond its dependency on the U.S. In any very significant way. Can you help us out on that?
Yeah, what I see in the Mexican government is it is very funny, because if you see the ideology of the Mexican government, you can say, well, it is a left-wing government. Usually now, and in the last couple of months, the narrative has been much more radicalized, anti-United States, and with the sovereignty narrative and everything. So it would be that would be the first thing, or the first argument to start a diversification strategy. But the thing is, they don't want to. I don't know exactly why. There are people inside of the Ministry of Economy, not in the higher level, but in middle level decision making, that have been advising on the diversification of the economy, looking for these trade agreements that Mexico already have. But in the top level, they said that it will take long. And the thing is here that in the case of Mexico, different to what might is happening, for example, what Ben was saying about the midterms in the US, Mexico has elections next year. And for the Mexican government, elections are a very important point. So in the case of Mexican government showing for the coming elections, midterm elections in Mexico next year, showing that they were able to sign an agreement is something very important. So it doesn't matter if they can diversify or not, if they can start utilizing the trade agreements they already have. The thing is, they want to show the Mexican people they were able to have an agreement for political and electoral purposes. So that's the thing, and that's of course my lecture, as I have seen, as I have been working with the government before. So yeah, that's the problem, because if that is the only way to read the Mexican strategy, it is very short term.
Thank you.
Okay, on that, thank you so much, Solange. We're going to have to leave it there. I know we could probably go on for several more hours on this topic, but we will leave it there. Thank you, Solange. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Eric. Thanks so much to Ken for co-moderating. We'll continue to follow this and the future of North American trade relationship, as well as other issues in the Canadian and Mexican bilateral relationship. And again, a special thank you to our partners, the Stimson Center, to all of you for joining us this afternoon. We again invite you to follow the Canadian Council for the Americas on social media, as well as the Stimson Center. Our website is ccacanada.com, and please follow us there for information on upcoming events and programming, and the videos from today will be available as soon as possible up on our website. Thank you again, everybody. Bonne journée. Gracias a todos. Thanks so much.
Gracias. Chao.
Me cansó la pila.